So hey everybody, how's it going? Before I get started, can we put our hands together for Anne and everyone who put on this amazing conference, because this is like really awesome. HTML5Devconf is actually the first conference I ever spoke at a while back, so it's always an honor to be invited back to speak with you all. My name is Rob Dodson. I'm a developer advocate at the Googles. I work on this project called Polymer. It's sort of my sole goal in life right now, to get all of you up and running using web components and using Polymer. That's what we're going to be talking about today. So what I want to start off by doing is sort of looking at how we're currently building our websites and our applications, how we've got to sort of prepare for this new multi-device world. And as we're doing that, we're going to look at some cool new technologies that'll help us out. We're going to look at web components. We're going to dig into Polymer. You know, if you've ever heard someone on Twitter talking about Shadow DOM, and you've been like, that sounds really cool, but I have no idea what they're saying. That's what we're going to be talking about today. And we're also going to look at some cool new tools that maybe we can use in our apps and everything, so that perhaps the future of web design looks a little bit different. We're going to talk design in this talk, right? There's going to be a fair bit of design. It's going to get a little artsy in here. We're also going to talk the codes. It's going to get a little nerdy in here. Okay, we're going to do both. Because what I want to do is take designers and developers, and I want to bring you together. We're going to need both sides of the coin, both designer and developer, in order to better address and to solve all of the dilemmas of the new multi-device era. Because really, this is what it's all about, right? This is, as an industry, we're sort of grappling to deal with this infinite continuum of different screen sizes. And I want to show you some stats here just to really drive this point home. These are from Benedict Evans. He gave a really awesome talk called Mobile is Eating the World. This is data from about 1995 to 2013. The gray line is PC sales. The orange line is smartphone and tablets. And I think if you study this for a moment, you'll start to discern a pattern here. Maybe, you really got to study it. I didn't major in statistics or anything, but we've got about, in 2012, 350 million PCs were sold. In that same time, 1.7 billion mobile devices were sold, okay? Another stat from Benedict. So this is where we're projected to be in 2017. So the gray bars are where we were in 2012. Orange is where we're going to be in 2017. The last three columns are really the only three that you care about. So you got smartphones, PCs, and tablets. This chart is in basically billions of units. So we're projected to add about 2 billion smartphones to the world. We're projected to add about 500 million tablets. And the PC industry is not really doing so much there in that middle column. Really expecting zero growth in the PC world relative to smartphones and tablets. So this means that as designers and developers, we have to be engineering our sites so that they function in this mobile world. It is only getting bigger, much, much bigger. And more importantly, what that means is that we need to improve our process so that preparing for and dealing with building multi-device applications is not always some crazy experiment. It needs to be sort of baked into the DNA of our teams, that we just know how to build for the multi-device web. And Dave Rupert from Paravel wrote this really awesome blog post not too long ago. I think that's Dave over there. I think that's the amigo. Called Responsive Deliverables. And so he's got this post where he basically talks about how Paul Rand built up the Westinghouse brand sort of corporate identity, starting with very simple geometric primitives. Paul Rand kind of built it up into this logo. And from here, he evolved it using color palettes and typography until he got to the point where he could start doing business cards and letterhead, packaging, signage, like what the size of the trucks were going to look like. And all the while as he's doing this, he's just composing together simple components of various design elements to build interesting, different, complex things. Now what Dave says is that it was really the sum of all of these components which collectively made up the physical brand, what people thought of as Westinghouse. And the point of Dave's post is that this is how we should be thinking about the things that we build as web designers and developers. That rather than focusing on static comps and just trying to build those head to toe and hand them to our clients, Instead, we should be thinking in components. We should be thinking in component and design systems, because the things that we build are always going to be living and reacting to all of these different screen sizes. And as we work, we need to be asking ourselves, like, how's this thing going to work on a phone or a tablet or a phablet, which is what that is. That's the Asus PhonePad 7. That is 7 inches of phone. Which is a lot of phone to put on your face, but he thought it was a good idea. And it, it runs the internets. So your site, it needs to work on that thing. How is it going to work when it's just a few centimeters away from someone's eye, or when it's like 6 feet away on their crazy 4K TV? Because these are internet-enabled devices as well. And so what Dave suggests is that we all need to be building sort of like tiny Twitter bootstraps for our clients. This needs to become the new responsive deliverable. And these tiny bootstraps, they need to be custom tailored to our clients' needs. So I'll show you an example. This is Twitter Bootstrap, which I'm assuming a lot of you have worked with before. It's a really awesome component system, but it's very kind of generic and off the shelf. And so if you're just using this for your projects, then you're going to be, missing out on a few things. For one, it's not really custom tailored to your client's needs, so you're going to have to go in and strip out a whole bunch of stuff. Also, it's got kind of its own breakpoints, its own way of doing things. They're sort of baked in, and again, you're going to have to like tweak those and redo it yourself. Really, what we should be aiming for is doing this in a custom fashion so that we're building our own sort of living style guides. And I'll show you an example of that. So the team at Salesforce actually has produced like a really wonderful style guide. If you grab the slide deck later, you can grab the link. And so this is their style guide. And what I love about it is that it's sort of like a traditional style guide. You get typography and colors and things like that. But then they move on and they show you their components. And if you check this out, you've got what a component is, what the different kinds are, when to use them, and especially important, you've got the markup. You've got the code. So anybody who's looking at this can grab this code and drop it into any sort of like application or prototype that they're building. And they take this a step further, and then they show examples of the kinds of apps that you can build with it. And it's sort of like Paul Rand did with Westinghouse. They're just composing together these simple component pieces to build more interesting, more complex things. All right. Shrink that back down. So what's cool about building a living style guide is that as you do this, it becomes like a single source of truth for designers, for developers, for other stakeholders that are working on your project, right? As you take your design, you sort of deconstruct it into the different component pieces, everyone has this one place where they can go and they can look for changes and they can iterate on things. And most importantly, it allows you to sort of test the responsiveness of these components as you go, because you can always resize that style guide to see how things work in the individual. But there's sort of one problem with this whole approach, and it's really not specific to Salesforce, but I am going to use them as an example here. So this is a component that they've got called a calendar, right? Typical calendar widget. It's very nice looking, but look at all the markup required for this thing. There's a lot. There's a lot of HTML. And this is very typical of anything that you might have that's like sort of complex UI. If you grab something out of Bootstrap or Foundation, it's also going to be like tons and tons of markup like that. And so we're sort of at this state right now where building UI for the web is just kind of too complex. And it sucks because anybody using our style guide needs to stay in sync with all of that markup. So if we change just one line of that, well, someone's got to go back and like copy and paste that into their new app. So this is really where we're at today. This is what it looks like to build like a tabs widget on the web. This is sort of the bootstrappy, foundation-y style of doing it. It's a lot of markup. What we're going to do is we're just going to like shellac it with CSS until it looks kind of like tabs, kind of like what we want. And then maybe we use something like jQuery to kick off its behavior and make it do the little tab switching that we would like. Now, as we've been going through this sort of JavaScript renaissance, we've started to move away from doing things like this. And we're starting to move more of that work into our JavaScript. So this is an example from Kendo UI. This is an example from YUI, Angular, EXT. And I feel like it's sort of unfortunate that we're heading in this direction because we're doing two things to ourselves that are sort of bad. One, we're putting ourselves into little silos when we do this. If I build the most amazing EXT widget in the world, I can't share that with someone who's using like Angular or Kendo. Like my frameworks, they don't they don't work together. Also, I'm making it harder for designers and new developers to work with me because not only do they have to know HTML and CSS, but now they have to learn JavaScript, and they also have to learn some whole huge framework that has its own worldview for how UI should work on the web. And it sucks because really I just want something that kind of looks like this for building my tabs. If this existed, I would use it the same way that I use like the select element, or I use H1 or paragraph, right? I just use the markup, style it, and move on with my life. But for really like most of the history of the web, it has not been possible to just make up a tag and have it be treated as a real like first-class citizen in the document. And we're trying to change all that using this new set of technologies called web components. So if you haven't heard of them before, web components are basically a set of emerging standards which allow developers to extend what HTML is really capable of. Now, from the high level, what we're talking about is giving developers the ability to create their own custom tags. Let's see if I can bump that up a little bit. There we go. Giving developers the ability to create their own custom tags, custom HTML tags, that have scoped CSS styles. So the CSS that you write for these elements does not affect anything else in the parent document, and likewise, stuff in the parent document cannot accidentally get in there and mess it up. And you get encapsulated markup as well. So I'll show you an example of what that looks like. So this is how we create a carousel today, right? Like a little image slider that you might have at the top of your site. Very similar to the calendar example we showed before. It's a lot of crufty markup. I don't actually care about most of this. Like I don't care about div, inner, whatever, or overflow, or any of that stuff. The only thing I care about is like the 3 image tags that are going into that carousel. But if I'm using Bootstrap, Foundation, whatever, I copy and paste this thing into my app over and over and over again. This is the web component way of doing it. This is what we want to see. So you use an image carousel tag, you give it the 3 images that you actually care about, and that's it. You're done. You don't need to know every single detail for how that image carousel got built. You don't care about every detail about how that image carousel got built. And this does really cool things. So let's go back to that Salesforce style guide. Let's look at what they did once they had the ability to, oh wait, sorry, I'm totally jumping ahead. Let me show you this instead. All right, so this is the video element, right? Let's bust this guy open. We'll see where all the markup went. So when you're using a video tag, you just say, I want a video tag, source is foo, give me some controls. And you get all this free stuff from this built-in native element. And so you might think, okay, well that's just like browser magic. Like somehow the browser makers are just making play buttons show up. But if you go to the dev tools and you turn on this feature called enable UA shadow DOM, user agent shadow DOM, you can actually crack open the HTML5 video element, and you'll see that inside of it is just a whole bunch of HTML. Like if you bust that element open, you're going to see this thing called a shadow root, and inside of there, there's a div. Inside of that div is more divs. And watch our element highlighting up there. So as we work our way down, we'll see, hey, that play button, that's just an input element. The range slider, the scrubbers, all those things, those are just inputs that the browser makers have just hidden inside of this element. And somehow there's CSS inside of there that's styling it, but it's not jacking up the rest of my page. And so this is what we want to give to developers. We want to give everyone the power to make their own elements that are like video player, which is pretty dope, I think. Okay, now let's go back. Let's look at what Salesforce did when they had the power of web components. So let's go look at their calendar. Remember how many lines of code that was before? Okay, now it's 1 line of code. You just say, I want a calendar, and you get a calendar. It makes sense, right? And this is really empowering for both designers and developers. For designers, if you want to go inside of there and change the internals, move some HTML around, add some more styles, you can do that, and whoever is using your element does not have to like figure out all the differerences and copy them into their project. So that's great. It means you're more flexible with your designs. For developers, it means that you can add cool JavaScript. You could add like a lot of JavaScript, you could add a lot of markup if you need to build something that's really rich and really powerful. And again, whoever's using this thing doesn't need to see or know about all of that. So it improves the user friendliness a lot. So when we have the ability to create our own HTML elements, it allows us to really rethink a lot of things about the language. We could make HTML elements that are responsive by default. We could make HTML elements that have our own custom HTML elements that have accessibility built in by default. So everybody else is not running around putting in ARIA role tags and attribute tags and everything like that. We could make elements that are performant by default, and we're going to show one a little later. We can bake all of these things in. We can recreate what HTML is capable of for this new multi-device world. And so this is the real power of web components. We can rewrite the language and share it amongst ourselves. All right, how do we do this? So these are the 4 technologies which make up web components. There is no one magic web component technology. It's actually 4 different things which all sort of fall under this umbrella. We've got templates, custom elements, shadow DOM, and HTML imports. Templates is the ability to create reusable snippets of HTML and stamp it out in the page. If you've used a library like Mustache or Handlebars before, exact same thing, except now there's a native tag in the browser. There's an actual template tag that you can use. Custom elements is the ability to create custom HTML elements. So the image carousel that I showed before, the X-tabs thing that I showed before, those are custom elements. Shadow DOM, that's how we create a little sort of scoped bubble of style and markup. When we poked our way inside of the video element, all that stuff, all the hidden markup inside the video element, that's all shadow DOM. And lastly, HTML imports is just how we load these things into our document so we can start using these cool new tags. So if you look at the support picture here, it's good. I mean, it's actually a lot better than it was when I started speaking about this a few years ago. It's really good, but it's still not quite there enough for developers to start using these things in their projects in the sort of native fashion, right? Developers don't get paid to make a site that only works in one browser. And so this presents kind of a chicken and egg problem. We need developers to use these things so that they can give us feedback, the browser makers. They can give us feedback, and we can make sure that the syntax and the things that we're landing are good and feel good and people like using them. But the flip side of that is, again, developers don't want to use it until it works everywhere, right? So how do we get around this problem? So to do that, we created a library called Polymer. And Polymer is basically a little library which enables the use of web components in all modern browsers. So that's IE 10 and above, Safari 6 and above, mobile Safari, Chrome for Android, and then also, of course, stable Chrome, Firefox, Opera, etc. And so we did this so that you guys can all start playing with these things, dropping them into your projects or your prototypes and saying, hey, this particular API, it feels weird, it works weird, I found a bug, you know? And there's 2 ways to work with Polymer. You can either use elements that other people have created for you and just sort of drop them into your project, or you can create your own elements. And we're going to walk through both of those approaches. So using elements, this is probably where a lot of people will start. You might say, hey, I just want to add one cool feature to my site. Oh, instead of using a plugin, I'll just drop this element on the page. And the Polymer team has created a handful of elements which we're calling core elements. We think these are things that most people will want to use in some fashion. So it's for doing things like overlays, tooltips, lists, etc. I'll show you an example of one of them. So this is core drawer panel. And as you slide the screen down, you're going to see this thing collapse. So it collapses the sidebar out of the way, and then there's a little button that lets you open it up again. So you can use this element, and what you do is inside of core drawer panel, you just put a div on one side for the sidebar and a div on the other side for your content area, and you just start filling it with stuff. But what we've done is we basically saved you the work of having to do a big responsive scaffold. And we worked with the Blink team to make sure that this runs at 60 frames per second. That little drawer animation, it didn't the first time we created it. They looked at it and they were like, nope, it's got to be faster. So we fixed it. So now we have this tag anyone can use forever and ever and ever that runs at 60 frames per second, which is awesome. This is an example of what it looks like to actually use one of these things in code. So you include, up there in the top right, you include platform.js, which is sort of like our polyfill layer. It's what makes web components work in browsers. And then you just import the things that you would like to play around with. So we're importing a core toolbar element and a core icon button, and then that's it. I just use them. I just use these tags the same way I use any other HTML element. There is no big framework kickoff thing that I need to do. I just work with them the same way I work with any HTML element, because these are HTML elements. They are real registered custom elements. I'll show you another example. So this is core tooltip. Again, import it in. And rather than in JavaScript have to find the thing that should have a tooltip and add it or whatever, which is what a lot of jQuery plugins do, you just nest the button that you would like to tooltip inside of here. And then you get, boom, a little tooltip. All right, so that's using elements. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, if you can use HTML, you can use these things, which is awesome, and that's kind of the point, right? We want to make it super easy for everybody. So you're going to start using elements. You're going to be like, whoa, I have superpowers. This is amazing. I must go deeper. And then you can start creating your own elements, and Polymer is going to make that really easy for you. So this is what it looks like to define your own Polymer element. You use a Polymer element tag, so it's actually like a declarative approach for creating your own element. Inside this Polymer element tag, you give your element a name. I'm calling my element my-element. The dash is very important. It just tells the browser, hey, I'm registering a custom element right now. Treat it as such. If you don't have the dash in there and you just call your element like carousel or something like that, that will be a problem. Because at some point, HTML7 or something might decide to implement a carousel, and then you're going to be in like some hot water. So that little dash right there is very important. It makes sure that your elements sort of stay out of future HTML land. And once you've done this, you can put a template inside of here. That's the native template element, one of the 4 web component technologies. And inside of that template, any markup that you write is just going to render on screen when the parser sees your new tag. So inside of this template, I've got a style tag that says h2 should be orange. I've got an h2 just says hello from my element. So when someone uses my tag, what you get is an orange h2 that says hello from my element. Simple, right? Anybody who can write HTML and CSS can write this. You don't have to be like a JavaScript badass to make your own custom elements, which is important. One thing I want to point out, this h2 down here is orange. That h2 up there where it says declarative registration on my slide deck, that's also an h2, but it did not suddenly turn orange. And the reason is because everything that we have in that template is in the shadow DOM for our element. It's protected. So it's not going to affect anything else on the page. It's got its own little scope for its CSS, which is really nice. Now you may have noticed this NoScript attribute up here in the top right and been like, what is that all about? I'm confused by that. What NoScript does is it says, hey, I'm not going to include any JavaScript with this element. Now if you would like to include some JavaScript with your element, you totally can. You can give your element its own prototype. So this is a Polymer element called name tag. We've got a script block after our template, and we are just passing in the name of our element, and then we pass in an object. That object defines the prototype for every instance of our element in the page. Any properties or methods that we add to that JavaScript object are available on those tags that we've created. So someone can query selector for this thing and say, hey, I want nametag.owner, and you'll see Rob. Or if someone uses the element, we're going to use a little data binding here to actually pipe that value from the prototype into our template, which is just sort of a handy feature that Polymer adds to save you from having to write a bunch of glue code to like pass values around.
Why do you have to do that?
Why do I have to do that? Who asked that, by the way? Throw your hand up. There we go. Oh, what? Hey, Steve.
Why do you have to say no script or take it out if you do have script? And what happens if they don't match?
Right. So you have to say no script because I want to say there's some sort of like indeterminate quantum of time where like before the element can register, it's like, I don't know if someone's going to include some script. I don't know if someone's going to call document.register. I'll just sort of wait to see if that happens. And no script is like an explicit, hey, don't wait around. Like I'm never going to, in my own JavaScript, call document register. So just do it yourself. But it is an interesting discussion. There is a thread on the Polymer Dev forum where we talk about that. And so I'd say go check that out for a bit more history on that. All right, so it sort of sucks to like bake in the data for my name tag. It's not much of a name tag if it's always owned by Rob, right? You want someone to be able to pass in data. So to do that, you can actually publish properties from your prototype to the outside world so anyone can configure your element. To do that, you can use this little attributes attribute up here in the top right when you're defining your Polymer element. You can say, hey, I want to expose my owner property to the outside world. Now, anybody using my tag can pass in a value for owner, and that will just update in my element's prototype, and it'll update there on the screen. So now you see when someone uses name tag and they pass in owner as Eric, it says, hey, my name is Eric, right? Really easy, quick way to add some configuration to your element, and you don't have to write a bunch of JavaScript to like check these things and pass them around. Now, if you want to pass in a lot of content, you might want to pass in like, I don't know, thousands of words of content, or you might want to pass in more HTML, because you can pass in additional HTML and have it be rendered inside of your shadow DOM. So a way to do that is to use the new content element. This is something that was added by Web Components. So the content element basically invites stuff from what we call the light DOM into the shadow DOM to be rendered. So down here, I'm inside of my X ribbon tag that I've defined, I'm passing in a little bit of text. And in its template, I'm using a content element to invite that text into the shadow DOM. So now our little ribbon says HTML5Devconf. So again, really easy. You don't have to like know JavaScript to make this happen. It's all just happening in markup. And the last thing I want to show is how can you add a little bit of interactivity to this thing. So we've also added declarative event bindings. So on our H2 there, we've got on-tap, and we're binding that to a method on our prototype called sayHello. And so what happens is anytime someone taps my element, it just runs that method. So I don't have to write event listeners. More importantly, I don't have to deconstruct event listeners, because using declarative event bindings like that in Polymer is going to handle setting up your listeners, but also removing them so you don't accidentally create memory leaks. And using on-tap like that is also going to use our sort of unified mouse and touch and pointer event system. So, oh wait, let me click on that guy so you can see what happens. Howdy. There we go. So really easy. You don't even have to write a ton of JavaScript to get this going. Now, one question that comes up a lot is people are like, OK, cool, I know how to do this. Like, you've shown me the technical side of it. But like, how do I write a good component? How do I do things the Polymer way is something that people ask us a lot. And Adi Osmani has put together this really awesome guide. There's a link to it down there, but it's at adiosmani.com/first. I'll put the slides up afterwards so you can just grab that. But Adi's approach goes a little something like this. So he says, first of all, an element should be focused. It should do one thing and do it well. And if you've ever heard of like the single responsibility principle, it's basically that idea. You want to build an element that does kind of as little as possible, and it just does one thing really well. Your element should also be independent. So it should, address its specific concern, and it shouldn't need to know about like what's going on with every other element in the world. It shouldn't need to like dig into a bunch of other elements to get data to do its one thing, if you can avoid that. Now, it's OK to logically group things together, but you just don't want everybody in everybody else's business. Anything you write, you want to try to make sure it's reusable. So if you're making like a user profile page, and maybe there's like a little gravatar avatar type thing up in the corner, instead of making one big element that's like all user profile and trying to put the code for like gravatar and like a message list and like a profile or like a date timestamp, like instead of putting all of that into one big profile element, break it up into smaller reusable elements. Make an element that only goes and fetches gravatar images. And now you can use that element in other projects. You also want to make sure that things you build are small. So again, breaking that big profile down into the little individual pieces, it makes them smaller, easier to work with, and it also makes them more testable, which is the last part of all of it. All right, homework. How do we change our processes to deal with all of this crazy new stuff that you are talking about? We talked style guides, and we talked web components. Now, to put this in practice, we first need to start thinking in components. Every time we're kicking off a new project, there's sort of a natural tendency to like start building big comps of like all the important pages. So that's a good time to stop yourself. And instead think, how can I approach this process kind of like the way Paul Rand did with the Westinghouse Corporation? How can I start with basic elements and build my way up to bigger and bigger things? So Samantha Warren has this really cool project called Style Tiles. And the idea is that instead of giving your client like a comp of what a page looks like, you can give them something that looks kind of more like this, where it's almost like paint chips for interior design. So you start off with maybe like a logo, some basic color palette, basic typography, some simple patterns around like typography, layout, containers, but you're not comping out the entire page. And you and your clients can sort of iterate on these tiles and figure out what feels good, what works and what doesn't. And as you're doing this, you can be putting these into little web components. And from there, you can start creating your own style guide. So Brad Frost has this cool project called Pattern Lab, which is sort of like a starter style guide for you if you want to think of it that way. It's basically a little app which has like the beginnings of a style guide, and you just go in and fill it in with your own content. You sort of flesh it out and make it look nice. And he's got these buttons up here at the top for resizing it to like small, medium, and large. And it doesn't go to like a fixed breakpoint. Instead, it goes to like an approximate breakpoint. So you say, I want my style guide at, oh, there it goes. You say, I want my style guide at medium. And instead of going to like a specific size, it's going to go to a medium-ish size. And you click it again, and it'll go to another medium-ish size. So it's always forcing you to like think, okay, where is this breaking down? Where are things not quite working? So this is a really cool tool. I have not personally tried to like put web components in this thing yet, but if I was doing freelance right now, this is totally how I'd be doing it. Last step. So as we're working, let's try to build these things in Polymer. Let's try building web components for the deliverables that we're making for our client. So one thing that I've seen a lot, which I think is really weird and kind of concerning, is different organizations that I talk to have this workflow where they say, our designers put together a style guide, kind of like what we've been showing, with a bunch of like pixel perfect code in it. And then the developers look at that and they say this is great, and they throw it all away. And then they rebuild the components like their way, because they're like, we use crazy compiler or something, and it does not work with your lame-o designer stuff, so we have to redo it. In my mind, that is a lot of wasted effort. And so what I would love to see is building these things as web components, right? So from the outside, it just looks like a tag. It just looks like any element. But that gives the designer an area to iterate. And if the developer needs to come in and add a bunch of crazy like features, they can do so. They don't have to throw away the designer's work. They can just add it in, right? And to anybody using this thing, it still just looks like the same element. All right, so where to go to find out more information? Polymer-project.org. That is our website. I think I have a little bit of time left, and so what I really want to do is show you this like super cool experimental thing that we've been working on. So this may or may not work. This could totally explode. We'll see. So we've got this tool called the Designer. And the whole idea behind this is that, I'm just going to sort my screen out real quick, is that when you're working with web components, since everything is kind of like bundled up and encapsulated nicely, then you can do something like make a drag and drop IDE for building a website. And this idea actually works because stuff is not leaking all over the global scope. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to open up this little panel, and I'm going to drag out this core scaffold element and drop that on the page. And so this element is actually just core drawer panel. Do you remember that element I showed way earlier, the thing that's like 60 frames per second? Same thing, it's just we've like added a little bit of stuff on top of it. But if you switch over and you look at the code, you can kind of blow that up. There's stuff inside of here. So core scaffold actually like extends core drawer panel, but there's other elements that we saw. Like we saw core toolbar, I think, earlier. So that's just like in here, core menu. A few elements just like tossed inside of here. So I got this core scaffold, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop another element inside of it. I'm going to drop a Google map onto it. And we're on conference Wi-Fi, so this may totally not work. We'll see. All right, we're going to cross our fingers to see what we get. We might get nothing. Let's see if we can like tell the conference Wi-Fi to wake up. So we can drop a Google map element onto the page. And let's see what else we got. I see Pegman showing up. And we'll drop, oh, there we go. Yay, small miracles. We're going to drop this field on here. And we can style this because it's just like any other HTML element. So set its background color to white. Let's see if we can make that be cool. And what I'd like to do, this is like starting to look really Frankenstein. Do your thing. What I'd like to do is I'd like to bind the value of this map to that field. And so I've got another element that I can drag out called Google Map Search. And I drop this on the page. What's going to happen is you're not going to see anything, but over here in the property inspector, there are these values for like map and query. and I can bind Google Maps Search to my map element down there. So I can say, hey, I want you to search using my Google Map. For your query, I want you to look at this core inputs value. Okay. And then on my map, I'm going to tell this guy to bind to Google Maps Search, result.latitude, bind your longitude to Google Maps Search, result.longitude, zoom to 18. I don't know if this is going to work. Kind of looks like we might be out of luck on the conference Wi-Fi. But in theory, what we could do is we could bust out a search for Eiffel Tower. And if we waited really patiently, we might actually see something. Oh, holy shit, there we go. Yay! Ha, that was all planned. All right, so let's see. Back to the slides. Okay. Okay, so that's a kind of like a hobby project that we're building. We are not planning to put out some epic IDE, but that's the kind of thing that you can start to do when you can actually work with real encapsulated components. It starts to be sort of like interface builder for iOS, which I think is really cool and gives us a lot of power. Okay, so where to go to find more information? Polymer-project.org. Please hit me up on the Twitters or the Google Pluses, and the slides are up at robdodson.me/polymer-HTML5Devconf. Thank you, guys.